Welcome to the Bachelor After the Final Rose recap, where here we're going to be shifting things a little bit. There won't be any memes, Michael Scott won't be making an appearance this episode. Here we're just going to be covering everything that went down during Matt's post-show reunion, and also a lot of things that the show didn't air. Like where was Bree, and what happened with this unaired sit-down between Michelle and Rachael. And if you missed what happened during the 2-hour finale and Matt's final rose, be sure to go check out yesterday's recap detailing all of that. So, the AFR. Now, the first thing you'll notice is a brand new host for the evening, Emmanuel Acho, a former NFL linebacker, current analyst for Fox Sports 1, and host of Uncomfortable Conversations with a Black Man, which is also the title of his book. He's here to lead the conversation with Matt, Michelle, and Rachael after Chris Harrison was pulled from hosting the After the Final Rose for defending racially insensitive images that surfaced from Rachael's past, which he has since apologized for. Chris Harrison will also not be hosting the next season of The Bachelorette. That job is temporarily going to Tayshia Adams and Caitlin Bristow. That being said, it still remains to be seen if the franchise will be bringing him back for future seasons of the show. If you ask me, however, I personally don't believe that ABC is ready to completely sever ties with Chris, considering after all the controversy surrounding him and his stepping aside as host of the AFR, they still brought him in after the fact to do voiceover for this special.
Later tonight, Emmanuel Acho dives into the shocking conclusion to Matt's journey.
Where do things stand now?
Just him saying Emmanuel Acho's name there means they brought him in to do the voiceover after his replacement was figured out, and it just sort of makes me feel like the show is in a wait and see mode when it comes to Chris Harrison. Either way, I'm glad to see Emmanuel in here, as the conversations tonight most definitely shouldn't have been led by someone at the center of those issues. And Emmanuel starts the evening off by saying this.
Now, some of these conversations here tonight might make people a little uncomfortable, and they won't be easy. But my hope is that if we can talk openly and honestly, we can take important steps toward mutual understanding and healing.
And on that note, I want to be open in saying that while I'll do my best to encapsulate the words and perspectives of Matt or Michelle or Emmanuel, I've lived a very different life as a white man than they have, and I want to acknowledge that. So after Emmanuel introduces the show, first to come out and speak is Michelle, who at the time of the AFR airing had, only a half hour earlier, been broken up with on national TV. And Emmanuel asks if Michelle was really ready to be engaged to Matt.
After I saw how my family accepted him, he was able to slide right in. That's the moment that I did think he was the one.
But then it all seemed to go wrong. Matt broke things off, and Michelle says that she was caught off guard. So much so that in the shock of the moment, she didn't get to say her piece and didn't get to have that closure. So Michelle reached out.
I asked if I could talk to Matt for 2 minutes, just for me to say my piece. But he refused to have that conversation with me.
Well, Michelle is definitely going to get that 2 minutes tonight. But before we get there, Emmanuel then shifts the conversation to Michelle's reaction to the antebellum photos with Rachael. And Michelle says the more and more that came out, the more she started to feel hurt. And she says this is a prime example of not understanding the history behind those photos, not being educated enough on what that meant, what her actions actually meant, and how other communities see it.
I feel like Rachael has a good heart. I do. But I think there's a lot of learning. It comes off very inconsiderate.
From here, things then shift to Chris Harrison, and Michelle says that that was yet another weight thrown onto the hurt.
Everyone's talking around and addressing and apologizing and making statements, but not actually changing anything. There is a point where you're just so exhausted.
Well, Emmanuel then moves on to Matt and says it's time to try and get some of that closure that she talked about earlier. Matt comes out, and apparently this is the first time the two have seen or spoken to each other since the breakup. So Michelle turns to Matt and says when they broke up, she completely crumbled, and she had to walk away without closure and fill in the gaps of what their relationship really was.
It was a conversation so that I could have my inner peace when I left Pennsylvania. And you said no.
First, Matt apologizes and says that if he knew how she felt, he would have fought to have that conversation. Then he applauds Michelle for showing grace and composure in situations that he himself would have likely snapped in, and she has his respect and admiration for that.
If I could do it over again, I would have had that conversation with you knowing how you feel, and all I can say now is I'm sorry.
So the two then come to a place of understanding, and though Michelle has moved on, Matt will always have a piece of her heart, and she hopes that Matt will be able to move on too.
I hope you move on with kissing with your eyes closed. And I hope you come up with more phrases than just thanks for sharing.
Stone cold. So that's it for Michelle, and next is a solo hot seat segment with Matt, where the first thing Emmanuel asks is how much pressure was there being the first Black Bachelor? And Matt says, a lot. There's an extra level of scrutiny when you're the first of something, how you speak and how you present yourself.
A lot of what they take away from the show and the way that I interact with the women and carry myself, like it or not, is going to be their perception of how Black people move.
And Matt states that he felt any other lead is simply asked for one thing, to find love or to find someone they're compatible with. But the position he stepped into was to take on the weight of everything going on in the country at that time regarding social justice and everything going on within the franchise regarding diversity and inclusion. That's the pressure he felt.
I think it's just what we're conditioned to do as Black men, making people comfortable with your Blackness.
And Emmanuel asks if there's a part of Matt that wishes he didn't have to bear that extra weight. To which Matt says he doesn't regret being a part of the show, as he learned so much about himself and being open when it comes to love. Which naturally leads the conversation to his relationship with Rachael. And Matt says after leaving Pennsylvania, things started out like you'd imagine they would. There was a sort of honeymoon phase, until things came out on social media.
You hear things that are heartbreaking, and you just pray they're not true. And then when you find out that they are, it just makes you question everything.
And when Rachael came out and apologized, Matt was finally able to take a check on himself and see where he was at. And he realized he was not okay. These conversations reminded him of things he didn't want to think about, events, people, and places that he's not welcome at.
It was in that moment, in the conversations that I had, that Rachael might not understand what it means to be Black in America.
And Matt says that there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and he needs to step back to let Rachael do that work, and he looks forward to seeing all of that.
So you all are no longer together?
We're not.
Sorry to hear that.
Emmanuel then shifts the conversation to people who would say that if Matt loves her, couldn't he just teach her or help her grow?
Can you still, in 2021, condemn her for the actions of 2018 and let that dictate the love that you all share?
And Matt says that, firstly, he doesn't think anyone is irredeemable, and you can still care about someone and want them to be better at the same time. However, there's also a lot of processing he has to do, and he stepped back because he feels that this is a situation that he can't help, and he wants to let her do the work that she's committed to doing. And up ahead, Emmanuel is going to sit down with just Rachael, and she'll say it wasn't until the photos came out that she started her journey of unlearning. So when it comes to the point of why doesn't Matt help Rachael, one, I don't think the onus should be on the hurt party to recover the relationship, and two, I think it's understandable for someone who's lived their whole life as a man of color to not want the added emotional burden of educating someone who's just started to understand racial issues. And perhaps the situation might have been different if they actually got engaged. So next out is Rachael, and things go right into the photos of Rachael at the antebellum ball. And antebellum literally means before the war.
And so the antebellum South is literally honoring the South before the war in question, the war that freed slaves.
Yes.
Now, looking back at this photo, Rachael says that her part in this was steeped in ignorance. She never asked herself what was the tradition behind this, what does this represent, why do we wear those dresses?
No, I never took the time to make that connection, because if I would have taken the time, I easily could have understood what was wrong with it.
And Rachael says that she puts the onus on herself. She doesn't want to make excuses like this was her upbringing or this is normal where she comes from.
I think that people need to realize that just saying, like, this is normal where I came from, or this is common where I came from, that doesn't make it right.
And Emmanuel says that we need to remind ourselves that history is meant to be remembered, but not all history is meant to be celebrated. And he also wants to recognize, and I'll quote him directly here, there's a difference between being racist and racially insensitive or racially ignorant. I've been very intentional about saying what you did was racially insensitive, it was racially ignorant, and it plays itself out as racism.
But that doesn't necessarily classify someone as racist. You have to pull back the curtains and look at their intention. Was their intention malicious?
So Emmanuel says that Rachael knew Matt was a black man and knew she was going to be on The Bachelor. As a result, did she ever lay awake at night thinking those photos were going to come out? And Rachael says she never thought about it once. Up until it was all made public, she just thought of it as her and her friends in a dress. And when it comes to the breakup, Rachael says that knowing how strong their relationship was made her realize that Matt must have been extremely hurt by her actions if it resulted in him ending things.
I lost the love of my life, but in the process of that, I hurt him while doing so.
So, it's time for Matt to come out. Right away, Rachael apologizes, and Matt searches for the words to properly express himself. And this was so long, it even went into a commercial break. Eventually, Matt gathers his words and starts speaking to Rachael.
The most disappointing thing for me was having to explain to you why what I saw was problematic and why I was so upset.
And Matt says that's not a conversation he signed up for. He was caught off guard, he was hurt, and he needed to step back from the relationship. But when it comes to an eventual reconciliation,
I don't want to be emotionally responsible for those tears, because it's like the reconciliation that needs to be done is work that I can't do for you.
Matt then says he knows she's capable of doing it, and he doesn't want people to cancel or call her out, he wants them to call her in. And Emmanuel asks if Rachael has anything else to say to Matt.
I'll always be thankful for, everything that we shared in the time that we did have together.
So, Matt and Rachel's Bachelor journey ends here. Emmanuel wishes them both good luck on their paths ahead, and finishes off this segment with a note that I agree with.
Like Matt said, I don't agree with cancel culture, but I do agree with accountability.
Oh, and of course, before things close out, Emmanuel brings out Michelle and Katie for a special announcement.
Because a decision has been made. Should we tell Bachelor Nation?
We're the Bachelorette.
Yes, there are going to be 2 separate seasons. Katie's starting in the usual Bachelorette slot in May, and Michelle's will air in the fall, sort of like what we had with Claire and Tayshia. And along with this, there are a whole lot of other details we're going to talk about on the channel very soon. But as this AFR comes to an end, there are still a couple of other questions left unanswered. Like, where was Bri? Well, apparently, according to Bri herself in multiple interviews like here with Extra...
So you were at AFR?
I can confirm that I was there.
Okay.
But Bri says she thinks that there was just too much to get to with Rachael and Matt and Michelle, and so she got cut from the show. Something the Bachelor people have been doing all season. Which sucks because while Bri got some closure off screen, we as viewers didn't at all. And wait, did I say Bri got some closure? Yeah, not so much.
I haven't had an opportunity to talk to Matt. I did not talk to him after the final rose.
Wait, what?
I'll leave a link to that full interview in the description below. And on top of that, there was another segment cut from the AFR, a conversation with Michelle and Rachael. Emmanuel talks about it on his Twitter page here.
Michelle walks out, they sit down on the couch together, and after Michelle pours her heart out and Rachael pours her heart out, the two shared an embrace, and I simply sat there and witnessed it and thought, if we could see this collectively as a society, we could all grow.
And there you have it. The After the Final Rose for Matt's season of The Bachelor. And before we go, know that this AFR is edited just like anything else on the show. I mean, they cut out whole segments, right? So there's a lot more from behind the scenes that is sure to come out, and a lot more to discuss in the days and weeks to come. So thank you for joining me for this recap and for this season. I know these are sensitive and uncomfortable topics, so please keep the comment section focused on open, healthy, and respectful conversations. And of course, there's more content on the way, including a review of Matt's season, more info on the Bachelorette seasons and Bachelor in Paradise scheduling, and until next time, Bachelor Fantake, out.
Now, some of these conversations here tonight might make people a little uncomfortable, and they won't be easy. But my hope is that if we can talk openly and honestly, we can take important steps toward mutual understanding and healing.